our first speaker, who is Professor Andrew Davison, who is a professor of robot vision at the Imperial College London, and is a pioneer in self-localization and mapping, and I would say almost needs no introduction, but his main research interests are in improving the performance of SLAM systems in terms of time, dynamics, scale, detail level, efficiency, semantics, to enable real-time 3D systems that enable spatial awareness. And he will tell us about representations and computational patterns for Spatial Aai. Thank you very much, Andrew, for accepting our invitation, and I'm also very much looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, pleasure. Great to be here. So can I just check my screen share is coming through okay and you can hear me well?
Yeah, perfectly.
Great. And can I also just check on the timing, Julien? So what?
So we have 30 minutes slot, and okay. I would say initially was 20 minutes a talk, 10 minutes question, but as you saw, I think this is pretty fluid.
Yeah, got it.
And we have the coffee break after. I mean, coffee, depending on where you are in the world. So yeah.
Yeah, great. So, well, thank you very much for inviting me to the workshop. It's a pleasure to be here with so many excellent researchers, many of whom I know well. Of course, I enjoyed the last two talks very much. So I first visited, he probably doesn't remember, but I visited Professor Ishikawa's lab in Tokyo back when I was in Japan in the very late 90s, and I think probably saw a demo of his first 1000 hertz vision chip, which I found amazing and has been inspiring me ever since. So it's really great to see everything that he's been doing since. So I'm going to talk to you about representations and computational patterns for Spatial Aai. So this is rather broad. I'll explain what this means and why I'm excited about it. But just to give a bit of context to start with of what I'm interested in and really have been interested in through my whole career. So in particular, I've been working in SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping, the fundamental ability of robots or other smart devices to understand the spaces that they are in, to understand their positions in that spaces, and to build useful representations or reconstructions or maps of those spaces that they can actually use to do intelligent things. And ultimately, what we want is for, useful things to come out of that and products. And so it's been exciting for me, having worked in this area for, over 20 years, to actually see products on the market now that do use vision-based SLAM. And here's a few examples. And interestingly, they are quite a range of different products that have quite similar capabilities in terms of SLAM and vision in robotics, in things that run on mobile phones, in headsets for AR and VR, and also in drones. A lot of these devices have quite advanced visual SLAM systems. I think it would be fair to say, though, that all of these are kind of fairly preliminary products. So what they get from their vision systems is generally they'll build a sparse SLAM map of a scene, which they can use for pretty accurate positioning. They'll have some level of dense and possibly semantic understanding of the scene around them that they can use for intelligent action. But, I still think we have a long way to go. So just as a little bit of vision, imagine some of the products we might aim for in the longer term future. And I should just explain this term Spatial Aai. So this is my kind of term I've been using recently to describe not what I think comes after SLAM, but what I think SLAM has always been trying to do and has always been kind of gradually evolving towards a much more sort of general spatial intelligent sense of the scene around you. So what might that enable once it gets better? So for instance, general purpose home robotics. And I should say that this picture here is just something from the internet that's certainly not representative of any real product being built by any real company. But imagine a robot that really could, tidy up a room in a general way. Now that product doesn't exist yet, and it's a really, really hard thing to build. And I think it's especially hard to build once it has to fit within the constraints of a real product of, price, aesthetics, size, safety, power usage, and all of those things. And here's another product that doesn't exist yet. I know a lot of companies are working on this, but a really breakthrough augmented reality product that I think when it exists will completely change the world, and ultimately I think probably become the next major computing platform that may replace smartphones. So this would be the AR system that might provide a robust and accurate real-time overlay and spatial memory of all places, objects, and people that a person has ever seen. You could ask it intelligent questions, where did I leave my keys? And it would just tell you. But yeah, again, for this to become a breakthrough product, it has to fit very, severe constraints. It probably has to weigh not much more than a normal pair of glasses, and it would have to have all-day battery life. So really, the point I'd like to make in both of those areas, which interestingly, I think either in robotics or in augmented reality, whether there's a human in the loop or not in these systems, I think that the capabilities you need from a spatial AI system are actually really quite similar. They need to build these intelligent semantic geometric representations of the scene that can be used to ask questions. But we're still miles away, I think, from where we could possibly get to in this area. So there are some current products that do already exist. There are research prototypes, in places like my lab, in huge labs in companies, of course, and other universities. But then there's this big gap to full spatial AI. And I think especially when we want to get these really high capabilities, but also within the constraints of real products, so running especially on low power, on cheap hardware and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to be working on this for a long time. So I've been thinking about this quite generally, thinking about what the capabilities are that we would really want from this spatial AI system, and then how we might actually cross this gap to achieve these capabilities with efficiency. I've written some papers about this that you might be interested in. There's two of these future mapping papers, which are really sort of discussion position type of papers with some technical content, and they have some hypotheses. So in the future mapping 1 paper, we have the basic hypothesis that there's some commonality to a spatial AI system. So whatever the application is, whether it's a home robot, a drone, or an augmented reality system, it's going to be building some sort of metric geometry, combining that with semantics, and there's a sort of general set of things we're trying to achieve there. Of course, then subject to many different sort of performance measures and constraints depending on the different systems, but those number of parameters of different performance measures and constraints may be relatively few. So that's a hypothesis in that paper. So turning a little bit to where are we now in terms of the sort of systems we can build now, especially in university research labs. So we've been through this sequence of research in SLAM. We had early visual SLAM systems. So for instance, my mono-SLAM system, originally from about 2003, was one of the first real-time single camera SLAM systems that could actually work on a monocular camera and build a real-time 3D sparse map. We went through dense reconstruction about 10 years ago, systems like DTAM, Connect Fusion, and then more recently we've been interested in adding this semantic layer. So for instance, I'll just show a very quick video here. So Semantic Fusion was a system that would combine a dense reconstruction system with a CNN-based network that would provide semantic labels for frames and try and fuse all of that together into a real-time, dense semantic reconstruction of a scene. So that worked, you know, somewhat reasonably well. But I think what I'd like to point out is both the results are, you know, far from perfect and probably not yet really usable for anything useful, but also this. So this is a complicated and very heavyweight system. And in some senses, what we've been doing over the last, you know, 15, 20 years especially, has just been throwing more and more compute at these problems. And we're able to achieve more like dense mapping, like semantics, but at the cost of this, you know, complicated heavyweight system. So don't worry about reading anything on this, but this is just a sort of rough sketch of the kind of system diagram of something like Semantic Fusion with computation blocks in yellow, with data in green, with all the kind of data that's passed between these blocks. So Semantic Fusion ran, it was a CPU, GPU system. It was using a depth camera as input. It had rather large and expensive representations. So the representation of a room was using circles, I think 5 million circles or so representing a room. It had then, you know, data going through CNNs, and it was pretty complicated. So, you know, and using hundreds of watts of power, I think. So the main point is this is very far from something we could embed in a tiny, efficient device. So how are we going to attack this problem? And I think in our lab, we have two key lines of attack approaches that we're taking. One is to think about representation. So especially think about, you know, the blocks of data and the flows of data through a system like this. Can we do something more efficient than sending around, you know, huge, you know, images, 3D volumes and things like that? And in particular, machine learning is helping us a lot on that area of research. The second line of attack that I'll come to in a second, and is probably most relevant to this workshop, is hardware. But just to say something briefly about representation first, and a couple of the things that we're trying in our lab. So one kind of key one that we've been looking at for a long time is, rather than building up a map in terms of layers of, you know, sparse features, dense geometry, semantics, what if we kind of cut to the chase and directly make a map at the level of objects? And we've had several nice papers on that, but I think the most recent one that would be worth looking at is called Node Slam, where we essentially can build a map of a scene as a graph of objects that also have individually optimizable shape parameters. So when we detect objects in this scene, we can actually fit their shape based on prior knowledge of the kind of family of shapes that make up each of these particular object categories. And then we, you know, those objects basically become our map. So this is in fact a very kind of efficient semantic representation of this scene. The other kind of recent work in representation, I'll quickly mention something we just very recently made public, a system called IMAP. So this is another system that kind of uses some deep learning in the loop of a SLAM estimation system. And it's using a general MLP network as a unique scene representation. And we actually optimize that network in real time against a sequence of input depth images in order to build a representation of the scene, which is actually quite efficient. So this is a scene represented by a neural network, which fits into about a is that right? About a megabyte of weight. So it's really a very efficient kind of map. And you'll see that after a bit of time, it optimizes into this smooth and pretty high quality representation of the scene, which has very nice properties like it fills in holes automatically. So I don't have much more time to talk about this now, but certainly have a look at the full video and paper online if you're interested. And just let this part of the video finish. let's just go to, yeah, here where we can see the full kind of reconstructed room. And in fact, something we're really investigating now is the properties of this reconstruction with regard to how the network has kind of compressed the scene. And what we're investigating now is how we can actually build semantics into this as well in a very efficient way. Okay, so that's work on representation, which is very much ongoing, but I'd like to talk about the other aspect here of how we're going to really improve on this, which is hardware. And this is something I've been interested in for a long time. So, you know, as I mentioned, inspired by things like Professor Ishikawa's work from a long time ago, this general kind of observation that we've been using hardware for vision and AI that wasn't really designed for vision and AI. It was designed for other things like, you know, video games have inspired a lot of things like GPUs and depth cameras like Kinect, for instance. But we're entering an era now much more where people will be designing hardware for AI. And in particular by hardware, I mean sensors and processors, and then also presumably the bringing together of those things that people in this workshop are particularly interested in. So when event cameras, well, not when they came out, but when I first heard about event cameras, I was immediately interested in that. I had previously been pretty interested in high frame rate vision, but had always come up against this issue of, unless you're kind of building the processor into the high frame rate vision system, then you've got this huge data flow, and that seems like a problem. So an event camera immediately gets over that by only sending you the differences. And back in 2014, we did some of the first work on showing that you could actually go from a real-time event stream to a pretty high quality, intensity reconstruction of the scene while simultaneously tracking the motion of a camera with respect to that. So this is some of the work I did with Hae Kim back in sort of the early days when event cameras were still not very well known and were only sort of starting to cut through into mainstream vision and robotics. So that was it, event cameras, that was very useful to me. And then the other kind of thing that was really important was a project that I was involved in, so involving several other people who are on the call here now, but a joint project with Imperial College and the universities of Manchester and Edinburgh, really trying to think about what was going on in processing hardware and how the algorithms we were using in SLAM relate to that. So in particular, we produced in this project tools like SlamBench, which is a SLAM benchmarking suite, but which is not just about accuracy, as most of our benchmarks are. It was also about computational performance, and we had sort of common algorithms that we could run on a range of processors, from a huge desktop GPU down to tiny embedded boards. And the idea was really to look at the algorithms we were using, figure out which parts of those algorithms were good or bad for particular sorts of processing hardware, you know, whether you were serial or parallel, for instance. And we learned a lot by doing that. And I think that's really got me, you know, into the frame of mind now of thinking about what are the right sorts of processors we should really be using for this sort of work. And if you look at what's out there now, there's CPUs and GPUs that we all know about pretty well, but now there are really interesting new things emerging. So in fact, this slide comes from the company in the UK called GraphCore, and they have a new processor, which they call an IPU, or an intelligence processing unit, which is a chip which is massively parallel like a GPU, but it has a very different sort of structure in that each of these parallel cores can be running a very different program. And then it has a very kind of high performance interconnect structure, so that pretty much all-to-all communication and message passing between the cores on a single chip is possible. And then it has a lot of memory actually on chip. So each of these individual cores has you know, a significant amount of memory that it can use. So these sort of processors are suitable for, you know, sparse graph message passing type of algorithms. So this is a visualization from GraphCore. So their chip at the moment is being sold as a server chip with the application aim of accelerating deep learning in the cloud. This is one of their visualizations where they take a neural network and they look at the connectivity structure of all the computation that it does, and they map that basically down onto their hardware and figure out what's the best way to lay out all of this computation, if you like, geographically on the chip. And this is just a cool visualization that gives you some idea of how that's done. So very much inspired by that, and this is something else discussed in the future mapping paper. I've been thinking about, what is the graph-like structure in the SLAM problems that we are interested in, and how might we therefore think of laying that out on hardware. And this has led to very kind of interesting thinking of thinking, well, where are the graphs in SLAM? A lot of the ways that we represent maps in SLAM have a graph-like structure, and there may be computation we can actually do in place within a map like this. So supposing, think of something like a loop closure operation, it's kind of an optimization on a graph. We have like real-time graphs similar to the thing I showed you in the Semantic Fusion picture of computation and how it's connected. And then thinking more generally, some of this processing might be embedded in a single chip, like a graph processor might store your map, but other parts of this graph, I think, can be much more spread out. So maybe among multiple processors and devices within a single unit, like a robot, it might have cameras which could have processing built into them. It might have sensors and other actuators that might have processing built into them. And then this robot itself might be part of a larger network of multiple robots. But anyway, you can imagine a big graph connecting all of the processing and storage that a device like this wants to do. So what I've been really focused on in the last year or two is, how would we actually do all that processing in a general way? And processing on graphs in SLAM in especially is pretty well understood these days. And we have the factor graph formulation, which means you can lay down any probabilistic inference problem and draw it in the form of a graph where you have the variables that you're interested in, these white circles here, connected by factors, which basically represent your observations. And what you're trying to do in a factor graph is inference, so determine the most probable values of these variables given the observations that you have. So there's a very nice new review article about factor graphs from Frank Delert, who's been someone who's really pushed this formulation in robotics and vision. But have a look at this review article. But there are many algorithms for doing computation on factor graphs, and I've been interested in the ones that can actually have this distributed character. And in particular, there's this sort of algorithm called belief propagation, which you can do computation and inference on factor graphs in a completely distributed way with kind of node-based computation and message passing. And I think a lot of people have dismissed belief propagation for a long time, but we think it's a really good time to go back and look at it again. And especially the Gaussian belief propagation is a really, really general formulation. So the Future Mapping 2 paper is all about Gaussian belief propagation and how it could be the right tool for very general use. So I'm just going to show you something quickly here, which is, it's a kind of online article that we've actually been working on recently to illustrate Gaussian belief propagation. So this is work mainly led by Joe Ortiz, who's one of the PhD students from my lab. And this is hopefully something that we will be publishing soon. But we really want to give people a good feeling for the properties of Gaussian belief propagation. And we've got inside this various demonstrations. So here's the first kind of simple one. So what we're trying to do here is fit a set of points to a 1D set of height data. So imagine we've got these red observations and we're trying to estimate the heights of a surface along a regular array of positions here. This is what the factor graph looks like. Actually, if I move down to this one, I can show you interactively. So I'm going to make a few clicks here to sort of lay down some data. And belief propagation can work, first of all, by passing messages sequentially from variable to variable. So you'll see that as we pass these messages along, we are improving our estimates of the height. So each of these height estimates also comes with a precision or a variance we can estimate. And that's therefore then the fitted line here. So where this is a factor graph where we both have data terms and smoothness terms. So we want the whole line to be close to the data, but also smooth. And we can click on this to show that this is actually the same result as we get by a sort of standard inference message. But what's really interesting, if I clear this all again, and let's put some more data down here, is all sorts of other sort of message passage patterns also work. And this is what really interests me in Spatial Aai. So here we're going to iterate a sort of fully parallel message passing. So this is as if each of these variables is stored on a different processor, and they can pass messages between themselves synchronously. So after a few iterations, we get to the same convergence, or we can even do something that's even more sort of ad hoc. So let's say I lay some data out here and then just start passing random messages. So this is now, every time I click this button, a random node will pass a message in a random direction. And if I do this enough times, which isn't necessarily that many times, we need to get lucky and for a message to get passed to that one that's down there. And there we go. But after not many iterations there, we're again pretty close to the true marginals. If I just do a couple of these iterations, we should converge. So this is the amazing property of belief propagation for me: convergent behavior with arbitrary computation patterns. I really think that's the sort of property we need. So I don't have too much more time, but just to show you a couple more examples that are in this paper. So that was a sort of just a 1D line fitting problem. This is a 2D kind of relative pose problem, which is pretty much like a pose graph problem that we have in robotics. So we've got a set of 2D nodes here with relative 2D observations between them, and then we're going to solve this by belief propagation, by passing messages between them. And you can see the blue estimates in belief propagation and the green estimates come from a more standard method. And belief propagation converges to the correct answer pretty quickly. We can also, achieve the same thing by random message passing in this example. It, obviously takes more messages. But this, remember, is processing that can be done in a completely distributed way. It can even be completely asynchronous. So it really has the right properties that we're after. So a couple of other things about Gaussian belief propagation that we've shown recently. One is that you can use nonlinear measurement models, no problem in this. You just have to linearize your constraints all the time. Another is that you can use robust cost functions. So we have this nice trick. So if you want to use, for instance, not just Gaussian factors, but factors with a Huber kernel, which can take into account the fact that some measurements are just wrong, we can also do this in Gaussian belief propagation, and this really works. So here's just a quick example of that. So going back to the 1D problem, so here we've got a set of points in a line, but with a couple of outliers. If I'm trying to fit a smooth line to this, so this is just going to run continuous belief propagation. This is with a standard Gaussian function that treats all the data equally. This line is really pulled out of place by these two outliers. But if I switch to a Huber kernel, it start to ignore those outliers much more, as anyone who's used to robust estimation will be used to. If I just try something else here, let's try a set of data with a step here. So if I run this with a standard Gaussian kernel, I get this smoothed out step, whereas when I run it with a Huber kernel, we can preserve the edge. So that's like edge preserving smoothing. And in fact, the last thing I'll quickly show you here is how we can use that for image processing. And now that this now gets very close to what we're interested in the workshop. So suppose we've got this noisy image here. Just find the right thing. So we've got a noisy image, and we want to denoise it by removing the noise. We can do that by optimizing a factor graph that looks something like this. If we do that with a standard Gaussian function, we can remove the noise, but at the cost of blurring the whole data out. Whereas when we do it with a Huber kernel, we can remove the noise, but keep the edges in the scene. So I should say that this demo here is running in real time on my laptop. This is using WebGL behind the scenes, so it's running fast because we're actually using a GPU. And a GPU here works well because this is a computation pattern on a regular grid that fits very well with what GPUs do. But in fact, the talk after the coffee break from Raluca Scona from our lab, we'll be talking about a much more general use of belief propagation that includes not just neighborly factors here, but also some longer distance connections, and show how belief propagation is much more flexible than the sort of computations that we're normally used to, and may enable, you know, new sorts of competence. Okay, so let me just go back to the main slides and finish off. So yeah, so I'm very excited about belief propagation, and I really like this term factorized computation, which is from a paper from some of the later speakers. So Piotr Dudek, Julian Martel, for instance, were involved in this as a really good way of thinking about the sort of computation which I think is right for mapping onto hardware. The most kind of concrete thing that we've published so far with Gaussian belief propagation was showing that you can do bundle adjustment in this completely distributed way, and we implemented that on GraphCore's IPU and showed that it could be, you know, up to 30 times as fast as running Ceres for bundle adjustment on a CPU, which is a chip of kind of the same size. So, you know, one of the messages I want to get across is, you know, to get to full spatial AI, we need to map processing onto hardware, but we can't just map the easy processing onto hardware, things like feature detection, you know, image smoothing. We need to map the complicated loopy type of stuff that we would normally have to always do on a CPU, because you can't do bundle adjustment very well on a GPU. But if we think more generally about these things, the right sort of algorithms and the right sort of hardware, we might eventually be able to map the whole of that complicated processing that we have in something like a semantic fusion system onto new hardware that might be really efficient. Okay, so I think I need to finish up. So just to conclude, so spatial AI research, I think we're going to be doing it for a long time. It's about efficient 3D scene representations and systems for incremental scene understanding. We should be interested in co-design of processors, sensors, and algorithms. And especially I'm interested in integrated graph-based algorithms for estimation and machine learning. And just to quickly mention my affiliation, so academically I lead the Dyson Robotics lab at Imperial College, which is an academic lab working together with Dyson, especially with interest in home robotics. And I'm also co-founder of SlamCore, which is a London-based startup working on applied spatial AI solutions. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, for the talk, and again, like these little demos. So I saw you were running that locally, but are you gonna post that somewhere so that we can very quickly play with it? Okay,
so let me just stop my screen sharing. So we are planning to try and publish that imminently, but I don't yet have a time.
I mean, that looks fantastic. This is like the way you want to be taught this type of methods, because
I wish I'd had it, yeah, because it took me a long time to understand belief propagation.
Yeah.